Greetings, colleagues and enthusiasts of corporate law in Kenya. My name is Mathews Okoth, and I take this chance to welcome you again to Corporate Law Channel, a program through which I intend to serialize some of the leading corporate news items that are carried in a local daily newspaper called the Business Daily newspaper. Now, this is episode 2 of that program, and in episode 1, I discussed the process of administration of an insolvent estate. I am sincerely grateful for the feedback that I have received on account of that commentary. And in today's commentary, we will discuss something different: the legal nature of a company share in the context of enforcement of a court judgment. The legal nature of a company share in the context of enforcement of a court judgment. This discussion will be based on a case study, as is the practice now in this program, of a story which is carried in the Business Daily newspaper for Monday, January the 17th, 2022. It is titled, Jack and Jill owner sues friend's shares in Raw. Now, the gist of this story is that the owner of Jack and Jill supermarket lent his friend some money in the period between 2012 and 2012 to 2018, amounting to 477 million shillings. The friend partly paid this debt, and a balance of 167 million shillings was left unpaid. Now, the loan carried an interest, and as at the date of this reporting, it is claimed that a balance of 200 million shillings was owing. Now, the friend at some point, it is reported, tried to take out bankruptcy proceedings against himself. Of course, the effect of bankruptcy proceedings, if it were to be successful, would be to exonerate the friend from any debt by a creditor. Now, the matter, it is reported, was determined by the then High Court Judge, Justice Francis Tuyot, who dismissed the bankruptcy petition. I believe on the ground that the friend was able to pay the debt. Indeed, it is claimed in the newspaper that the friend holds properties in high-end estates, both in Nairobi and Mombasa, albeit in third parties' names. Now, subsequent to the dismissal of the bankruptcy petition, it is reported that the owner of Jack and Jill supermarket took out enforcement proceedings, and as at the date of this newspaper, it is claimed that the matter has reached the stage of attachment, which signals that there is already a judgment which is to be enforced by way of attachment, and whatever is to be attached is reported there to be the shares of this friend held in various companies, in 8 companies. So that actually forms the basis of our discussion today. Okay, and we will consider what really is meant by a company share in the context of enforcement of a judgment. How do you enforce a judgment? By attaching company shares. And if you enforce and someone acquires those shares in the process, what rights and benefits does the purchaser of the shares obtain, by purchasing those shares from an execution proceeding? So, to start us off really is we need to understand what is a share, what is a company share. I know many of you could be aware of a share certificate. Perhaps you hold one or you have seen one, and it is very likely that someone may mistake a share certificate to be the share. Okay? That may not be necessarily the true. A share certificate signals the existence of a share, but of itself exists independently of a share. In fact, in listed companies currently in Kenya, the use of share certificates is highly reduced because of electronic holding of the shares, okay? A concept in law called dematerialization, okay? Where there is a central securities depository that holds the shares that are traded at a recognized stock exchange, okay? Which in this case is the Nairobi Stock Exchange. So whether dematerialized or a physical paper, that of itself is not the share. The share exists independently of the share certificate, and as a legal concept is an artificial asset. A share is a bundle of legal rights that its holder obtains in a company. It's an artificial creation of the law, but which is signaled, if it is particularly for private companies, it is signaled through a share certificate. If it is a public company which is trading, it can still be held, signaled through electronic means, through electronic holding in a central depository, securities depository. But whether physical or in electronic form, the material question here is that that share certificate that perhaps you hold or you know someone who holds is of itself not a share. A share is a bundle of rights that you obtain if you invest in an equity of a company. Okay? Now, which are these bundle of rights that we are talking about? There are many, and they are enumerated in various laws that we have in Kenya, particularly in the Companies Act. Okay? But they can be broadly categorized into two, and I will discuss them more in the course of my commentary. One is the cash flow rights. As a holder of a company share, you obtain a cash flow right. That is the right to participate in the profits that the company makes. You must have had a concept called dividends. That is one of the rights that by virtue of holding of a share, you acquire as a holder of the share. And it ordinarily, not always, but ordinarily it is proportionate to the shares that you hold in the company. The other broad category of the right that you acquire by virtue of shareholding is a control right. And the control right is most pronounced in the election, re-election, dismissal of directors, the right to vote during the company meetings. So that essentially is the concept of a share. It's a bundle of legal rights. It is not the physical paper that it is. That physical paper is important. In fact, it's a requirement of law, particularly in closely held companies. But shares exist independent of the share certificate, the physical paper, or in the electronic form of shares held at the central depositories and settlement corporation, if it is a listed company. Okay? So, like I said, a share gives certain rights to a party that holds it, and it actually makes the holder acquire some kind of internal special status within a company. But more materially, the holding of the share does not make one an owner of a company. This is another concept which I know, has been misused by people. Okay, you've had CEOs of leading companies saying that my primary role is to generate as much returns as possible to the owners of a company. Holding of a share does not make one an owner of a company. A company exists as an independent legal entity, and I'll give you a practical example. If, for instance, you hold 1% shareholding in Safaricom PLC, which is a very reputable company by all standards, the fact that you hold 1% of shares in Safaricom does not entitle you, does not give you any right to appropriate 1% of the real estate of Safaricom. You cannot go to Safaricom headquarters and claim that by virtue of your 1% holding in Safaricom, you are entitled to 1% interest in the headquarters of Safaricom. You cannot claim that because you hold 1% shares in Safaricom PLC, you are entitled to 1% of its stock in trade. You can't say that you're entitled to be given scratch cards of Safaricom equivalent to 1% shareholding, 1% equivalent to 1% your 1% shareholding. So you cannot appropriate the property of Safaricom by relying on your shareholding. Okay? What actually you get by investing that 1% in Safaricom is, 1% cash flow right, 1% control right, which we will comment on shortly. So materially, it is just that a share is a bundle of legal right. It is not equivalent to ownership of the company. Now, let's apply now that concept. We are told, so materially, before we even go to that, you can see then that a share is kind of some kind of an intangible right. It's not something that you would go to and see, discern. You cannot see it, you cannot touch it. But there are certain rights that flow to you by virtue of its holding. So if now there are enforcement proceedings to execute a judgment, a problem arises because unlike tangible properties like a car, other movable assets like a car, which you can see, feel, okay? People who are familiar with the process will tell you that it is easier because an auctioneer can be easily appointed to proclaim that particular property, and after some prescribed period has passed without the owner of the particular asset redeeming the asset, then a sale, it is sold. But what happens in the case of an intangible asset? How does the court then proceed to enforce its judgment against that intangible asset called a share? So, like it happened in this case. So, what ordinarily happens is the process starts, just like any other execution process, where you are to apply for execution. But upon applying for execution, those who are familiar with the rules, if you particularly look at Rule 6, Rules 20, and Rule 66, those are the relevant rules of Order 22 of our civil procedure rules. It will give you the summary of the entire procedure on what happens. So once the application is made, ordinarily the deputy registrar will give what is called a prohibition order. And what this prohibition order does, like it would happen in this case, is that it prevents the holder of these shares from transferring the shares or receiving dividends on those shares. And ordinarily, simultaneous with the application for the prohibition order, a party that is seeking to attach those shares will also apply for an appointment of a particular stockbroker to sell those shares at ordinarily market price, so that the proceeds of those sale of the shares are then paid into the account of the decree holder. So that is actually where the owner of Jack and Jill supermarket is at this point. There is an application that has been made to court for the attachment of the shares. And I want to believe that, amongst other things, this application seeks for a prohibition order that would then restrain the friend of that owner of Jack and Jill supermarket from transferring the shares or receiving dividends. Okay? And also I want to believe that such an application would contain an order requesting that the court appoints a particular stockbroker to sell the shares at a market price. Okay? So it is not clear the nature of the prayers, but ordinarily we would expect that those are some of the prayers that are being sought in such an application. Now, assuming that that application then becomes successful, the shares are sold by a qualified or appointed stockbroker. There is someone that buys these shares at a market price, the purchaser. Okay. Now, once the purchaser buys the shares, under Rule 66 of Order 22 of our Civil Procedure Rules, there is need for delivery now. How do you deliver the shares to the purchaser, so that this purchaser then acquires these rights, this bundle of rights that we were talking about, into these 8 companies that belong to the owner, to the friend of the owner of Jack and Jill Supermarket. Okay. Now, ordinarily, if it were a tangible asset, there will be physical delivery. There will be a physical delivery of the particular asset to the purchaser of the motor vehicle or whatever movable assets at an auction. But in this case, because this is an intangible property, there will be need for another application under Rule 66 of Order 22. Okay, and the nature of the application is again a prayer for a prohibition order, which prevents transfer or receipt of dividends, but crucially, it compels whoever is in control of the company to effect transfer of those shares to the purchaser. And that's how then the purchaser of the shares acquires ownership of these shares in the company. Now, assume that that process then goes on, and the owner, the purchasers now acquired the shares. What benefits does this particular purchaser obtain in the company? Now, a lot of it will depend on the nature of the share. Again, it is not clear from the reporting on the nature of these shares that are being attached. Not all shares are the same. There are various categories of shares, and depending on the nature of the shares, they carry different rights, different entitlements. Some are automatic, some are discretionary at the controllers of the company. For instance, the most common share is what is called an ordinary share. So assuming that the shares which are attached are ordinary shares. Ordinary shares carry equal cash flow rights and voting rights. So the benefit that the purchaser will acquire is primarily is a control right. Okay, so this particular purchaser will then acquire the right to sit to vote during the company meetings. He or she will acquire the right to elect, re-elect, or dismiss the board. He or she will acquire the right to vote at all company meetings. Okay. Now, continuing to that is, dividend rights, a cash flow right. But the crucial thing about ordinary shares, assuming that the shares attached are ordinary, is that this dividend right is not an automatic right. It is a variable right. Ordinary shares carry variable dividend. Like assuming that all these 8 companies, for the friend of the owner of Jack and Jill Supermarket, are private company. Assume that all of them are private companies. Now, the payment of dividend will be dependent on the discretion of the board of directors of those companies. Okay? There is no automatic right to a dividend if you are an ordinary shareholder. That's the point. Okay? It is dependent on the declaration of the dividend by the board of directors of the particular company. There is an additional right that you will then also acquire, and this is a right to return to capital. If anyone or all of those companies are wound up at a particular point, he will be entitled to return of his capital. But the material point to look out for is that an ordinary shareholder is called a residual risk bearer. An ordinary shareholder sits at the very tail end of the queue in the priority of payment of claims. Okay, so much as yes, he will be entitled to a return of his or her capital, this particular purchaser, upon the winding up, if at all there is any winding up of those companies, but it will only be paid if other claimants that are higher in priority, like debt holders, people who, for instance, had loaned the companies, secured creditors and secured creditors, then if there are, what I'll discuss shortly, called preference shareholders, that is when, after all those claimants higher in the chain are paid, that's when the ordinary shareholder will be paid. Now, assuming that the shares that are attached are, say, preference shareholders, preference shares, or a mix of preference shares and ordinary shares. Preference shares are different from ordinary shares in terms of, the certainty of return and the priority of payment. So a preference share carries what is called fixed and cumulative dividend. The company constitution itself, the regulations that create these kind of shares, do create certain rights in them. You don't need a declaration by the board of a dividend for you to pay dividend on preference shares. By virtue of its holding, there is an automatic fixed dividend. It ordinarily is around 8% of the nominal value of that particular share. You are entitled to that fixed dividend, and cumulative in the sense that if in a particular year a company is unable to pay the dividend, you don't lose that right. You don't lose, it becomes a debt that is then carried forward over the years to the point when the company is able to pay for it. Okay? But those are not the only shares. Perhaps maybe there are other shares, because the news item is not clear on the nature of the shares. So there are other shares that could be also available in these companies. They're what are called redeemable shares, okay, which can be called back by the company at its discretion. They are what are called convertible shares, can be changed into debt instruments. Okay, they are what are called deferred shares. Okay, and the most contemporary, and I think the most interesting class of shares called dual class shares in most developed jurisdictions, to address this problem of founders of companies risking or fearing to lose control, particularly to large institutional investors. There's a concept which is emerging in those countries, which I hope in future we will also adopt in our country, called dual class shareholding, where they try to break. Remember, we were saying that a share entitles you to cash flow right and control rights. Dual class shareholding tries to separate those two kind of rights so that a control right exists independently of a cash flow right. So you find that if an institutional investor says, owns, buys, even over 50% of the shares of a particular class of shares, that does not mean that they acquire control of up to that 50%, because there is another class of shares, a different category of shares that carry a higher controlling power. Okay, so for instance, you may be asking yourself, maybe just as we close this discussion, companies like Facebook, Google, these are very successful companies, and ordinarily large institutional investors invest in them, banks, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, some investors that have money that cannot be matched by individuals. How do the founders of these companies remain controllers of those companies? It is through this so-called dual class shareholding, where there is a particular class of shares that has a higher weighted voting right. Okay, so in terms, the control right is given to this insider class of shares. That is called class B shares. Okay, and what is floated out there for sale to the public to invest so that they enjoy the cash flow right is a different class of shares, say class A shares. Okay, so Depending on, in summary, depending on the nature of the shares that were touched, the purchaser of these shares ultimately acquires particular rights, and those rights are dependent on the share, the nature of the share itself that were attached and that were purchased by him. Thank you very much for listening to me in this episode 2, and I hope that you found it worthwhile listening to me. Once again, my name is Mathews Okoth, and bye-bye for now.